Hey guys, so sorry I can't be with you today. I know we had talked about doing the PowerPoint presentations on the secular and Christian perspective of abortion. And by now you guys have done that, and I'm sure you did an awesome job. And from what I've seen, from what you already sent me, it looks like you did some good research. So, what we're going to do is we will have discussion next week when I'm back and we're not on C schedule, probably Monday or Tuesday next week, we'll have some time for discussion. But I just wanted to share this with you guys. Um, just some things you may or may not know, or your research may or may not have revealed on the secular Christian abortion topic. This is a baby at 6 weeks of life. Okay. So you can see eyes and fingers and toes and all of that forming there. You certainly see a cranial skull there. And if you don't already know, there's quite a bit of brain activity at 6 weeks. But some doctors, some people who are certainly in the pro-choice camp say the child is not viable at 6 weeks. They say life is not viable, which means it's not really living. It's just tissue, or it's just you know it's just organic matter. But that is one of the hot topics with this whole discussion is, those of us who believe, and I'm certainly in this camp, that life was life at conception. But man, I look at that and I say that is certainly life. That is the formation of a human being. But some say no. And this is the 8 to 12 week progression. Okay, you can see even more detail. And I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but there are people who say it's even not viable at 12 weeks. And when you look at that 12-week-old baby, or even really the 11 or 10, you're saying that's a fully formed human being, really. Just by the physical appearance, there's nothing to indicate there that life wouldn't be viable, that's not a human. But that is what some pro-choicers want to assert. Okay, and this is 18 weeks. You've got really a fully formed human there, and still they say not viable, some. And the camp gets smaller. It diminishes on the people who say that. But it just shows you what great lengths people will go to, have their own way or their own opinions validated. But certainly, I think most medical doctors worth their salt would say, oh, that's certainly a fetus. That's certainly a life. And this is 24 weeks. And 24 weeks is the very top level. That's as high as they go to say it's not valid life. Some people say that the child has to be disconnected from the mother's umbilical before it's viable, which is absolutely ridiculous, because a baby is a baby connected to the umbilical, right before it's born. To say it's not, there's no evidence or reason to say it's not. So that's a normal fetus at the 24th week of pregnancy. Very few would argue that it's not viable at that point, but some do. And guys, we talked about viability. We talked about sanctity of life. When is a human life a human life? Is it a human life as the moment it starts to form into a human, or is that much later down the line? And that's where a lot of the discussion takes place. So secularism, I was wrong. Secularism says 24 to 28 weeks is viability. So they want that 9 months to be done. They want that full pregnancy to be done before they say, the baby's got to be about ready to be born for them to say it's viable life. But some of the biblical perspective, and this probably came out in some of your PowerPoint presentations, Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. So we say as pro-life, as believers, life is viable at the moment of conception. But I guess I'm also in this camp that life, because God is omniscient and he foreknew when life would be, life was viable before conception. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. So to take it a step further, not only is life viable the moment that child is conceived, but according to Scripture, according to God, He had a plan for that life even before. He knew it was going to happen, and he had a plan. Galatians 1:15, New Testament, even before I was born, God had chosen me to be his. So man, when you think about all the aborted children, it breaks your heart to remember that God had a plan for them even before. Say, well, Dr. Cort, what if they were conceived out of wedlock? Or what if they were conceived as products of rape? Or what if they're, listen, whatever the circumstance, God knew. And the child is innocent. Regardless of the circumstances of the child's conception, they are a life, and they are a soul, and they are a life and a soul that God loves and cherishes. And God knew that they were going to come to be, and he had a plan for their life. I mean, how many great people were born out of adverse circumstances that would not have done the great things they'd done if circumstances determined whether they should live or not? Let that sink in a little bit. So God values and cherishes every life at the moment of conception and even before the moment of conception. Psalm 139:13 and 16, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So there's this theology, there's this Christian belief, there's this biblical teaching that God ordained and cherishes every life. And when we snuff those lives out and let's just be honest, most abortions are done because it's inconvenient for the people who had sex and got pregnant before they were ready for the responsibility, or they didn't want the responsibility, and they snuff out these lives. They kill these babies. They kill these children in the womb because they don't want the financial obligation. They don't want the time obligation. They don't feel like they're ready to raise a child. They don't want to get the woman doesn't want to go through 9 months of pregnancy. And it's a matter of convenience for them. And they don't understand, they don't know, or they don't appreciate, or they don't respect that God said, hey, I ordained that life. I cherish that life. I have a plan for that life. And if you kill that life, none of that will ever be recognized. How tragic it is that so many of these lives were taken in the womb. Who knows what these children would have become? And that's a strong part of the Christian perspective. I certainly land there. And you guys have asked me, and we are going to discuss next week. You said, Dr. Cort, what about in the case where you have to choose between the mother and the child? And hey, very difficult circumstance. And this is a case, and we'll talk about this more in our class, situational ethics, when God weighs motive. God understands that in a case like that the motive would never be to take a life, not the mother's or the child's. The motive would be to save life. But in the case where you have to choose between the two, God would understand whichever way you go. Let's say there's other children involved and they don't want to lose their mom and all these things. Or there's cases where the mom tells the husband, let the baby live and let me pass. Man, it's difficult. Very, very rare. Just like we talked about hermaphroditism, less than 1% of cases. This is a very rare thing, but it does happen. And people do have to make that choice. But that's very different in the way God looks at it. The motive is very different than, hey, we wanted to have sex, but we don't want the responsibility of having a child, so we're going to abort. That motive is completely evil, really. We're going to terminate the child because we're not ready to do this. Well, then you shouldn't have had sex then, right? That motive is selfish. Whereas the motive to choose to abort because you're saving the life of the mother, the life of the wife, that's a completely different motive. And so all of that needs to be looked at and considered and factored in. And the other case was rape. What about a young lady who's raped by a criminal, and she has to, go through the emotional strain of carrying that child for 9 months. It's not fair to ask her to do that. And I would say that's another very difficult circumstance. And it wouldn't be my place to tell her what to do. But if she wanted to talk with me as a pastor, Or as a friend, I would say, listen, even if you choose to abort because this is going to be difficult for you, you're still terminating an innocent life. And that's true in the case of having to choose between. There's no situation of abortion. If we abort, there's no situation where we are not terminating an innocent life, especially when we believe that God ordained life before conception. Life is life at conception. And this is why these people go to great lengths to say it's not viable at 6 or 8 or 12 or 24 weeks. It's not really a life. That's what they say. But it's just like with apologetics, there's no evidence to that fact. All the evidence points to the fact that it is a life. It has brain activity. It has a nose and eyes and fingers and toes and internal organ structure that works to sustain life from the very beginning. The smallest fetus will recoil at an abortion instrument when it comes in the womb to terminate, which tells you instinctually it's trying to survive. There's some horrific videos that I would never show in class because they're just too hard to watch of what goes on in the course of an abortion, even at some of the earliest phases. So guys, my hope and my prayer is that we will agree with God and cherish life at and before conception, and push against this in a society that says, hey, pro-choice, everybody has a right to do what they want to do with their own body. Well, you got two bodies though. The argument that the woman ought to be able to do what she wants with her own body is not a strong argument, because it's not just her she's making a decision for. There have been cases where the wife wanted to abort and the husband didn't, and what right does she have to take his child from him? Or vice versa. She didn't want to, and he did want her to. He pressured her to. You got a third person involved here, and you've got to consider what would the child want. There's an old musical I took my students to see years ago. It was called Mishpachah, and it was about this issue. And one of the songs said, "Save the child, save the child. If you really care, you'll do what you can do. Save the child, save the child. Would it make a difference if the child were you?" And these are all things to think about as Christians believing in the sanctity of life, that God ordained and loved and cherished and had a plan for every life before and certainly at conception. That's why we're pro-choice. But there are some difficult circumstances that require much love and compassion. But in those difficult circumstances, understand that God weighs motive. All right, guys, I just wanted to share that with you on this topic today. We will discuss next week, and good job on your PowerPoints. Love you guys. Hope to see you soon.